The guard stood still, emotionless, until the tourist crossed the line. In an instant, something inside him broke. Fury ignited in his eyes. He reached for his helmet, but what happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning. It was a typical Tuesday morning in Oakwood, where the peaceful hum of suburban life seemed unshakable. The sun pierced through clouds, casting long shadows across quiet streets lined with homes Greg Thompson had known for decades. A retired cop turned private investigator, Greg cherished the orderliness of his neighborhood, a place where familiarity bred comfort. But that morning, something felt off. As Greg sipped his coffee by the window, his eyes locked onto a man walking down the sidewalk. A stranger, but one whose presence seemed jarring in its normalcy. The man, broad-shouldered and dressed in a dark jacket, moved with an unsettling purpose. His skin was a deep brown, and his face was unreadable, offering no hint of intent. Greg didn't recognize him, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Without thinking, Greg grabbed his phone. "I've got a black man walking suspiciously down my street. He doesn't belong here." Greg's voice was sharp, an impulse pulling him to act. The dispatcher's calm response, "We'll send someone," offered little reassurance. Even as he spoke, a gnawing doubt crept in. Was this the right call? Across the street, Marcus Jefferson, Oakwood's new mayor, continued his morning walk, unaware of the eyes tracking him. He had just won a hard-fought election, and the last thing he needed was the suspicion of a resident who didn't know him. But the perception of danger hung in the air, thickening the already tense atmosphere of the city. Greg didn't know it yet, but the day would soon unravel in ways he never imagined, and it would challenge everything he thought he knew about his own community. The minutes dragged on, each second stretching the tension in the neighborhood like a taut wire. Greg sat in his chair, eyes fixed on the man down the street, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and uncertainty. Was he overreacting? The man hadn't shown any aggression, hadn't made a move that warranted alarm. He was simply walking, briskly, yes, but there was no hostility in his pace. Yet still, a feeling gnawed at Greg, a sense that something wasn't right. He couldn't shake it. Then, in the distance, the wail of sirens pierced the quiet morning. Greg's heart skipped. Relief surged through him. Finally, the authorities were on their way, but it was quickly followed by an overwhelming guilt. Was this really about ensuring safety? Or had he simply let his instincts, shaped by years of training, misguide him? Was it possible that his actions were driven by something darker? He couldn't deny the nagging thought at the back of his mind. Had he racially profiled this man? As the police cars came into view, Greg's pulse quickened. 2 patrol cars parked neatly along the curb, and from the corner of his eye, he saw Marcus stand still. He looked calm, completely unaware of the suspicion hanging in the air. His hands were at his sides, his posture relaxed. He was waiting for the officers, not for a confrontation, but out of simple curiosity. One of the officers, a young woman with sharp eyes named Officer Kelly, stepped out of the car first. Greg watched, his breath shallow as she took in the scene. There was something methodical in her movements, as if she was already assessing the situation with more precision than he ever could. "Good morning, officer," Marcus said, his voice even, betraying no emotion. "How can I help you?" Officer Kelly's response was calm, but firm. "We've had a call from a concerned neighbor," she said, her eyes scanning Marcus for any hint of defiance. "About suspicious activity in the area." Marcus blinked, confusion crossing his face. "Suspicious activity?" he asked, looking around as if he might find something that would explain the accusation. "That's right, sir," the officer replied, her tone professional but direct. "Can I see your identification?" As the officers examined Marcus's ID, Greg stepped off his porch, his legs unsteady, his face flushed with a mix of anxiety and shame. He had watched the interaction unfold in silence, his heart still heavy with uncertainty. But now, standing before Officer Kelly, the truth began to creep into his consciousness, though he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it fully. Not yet. When Marcus handed over his identification, Officer Kelly's expression shifted. Her eyes widened, and she looked from the ID to Greg, her gaze piercing. Greg stiffened, feeling something shift in the air, as though the ground beneath him had started to tremble. "Sir, do you know who you've just called the police on?" Officer Kelly's voice was tinged with disbelief, the weight of the question settling like a heavy stone in the pit of Greg's stomach. Greg blinked, confusion clouding his mind. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice faltering. She gestured toward the ID, her hand steady. "This is Mayor Marcus Jefferson, the new mayor of Oakwood. You've just called the police on him." The words hit Greg like a slap to the face. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. But the truth slammed into him with brutal clarity. The man he had watched, the man he had suspected, was the very person responsible for the changes he had grown accustomed to in his town. And he had mistaken him for a threat, simply because of the color of his skin. Greg felt his stomach churn as the reality of his mistake sunk in. A deep, bitter pang of regret gnawed at him. He had made an assumption, one that he could never undo. Marcus, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, let out a small, knowing sigh. "It's all right, officer," he said calmly, his voice steady. "I understand where he's coming from. It's just unfortunate that this still happens." Greg's body went numb. His face drained of color as his hands began to tremble uncontrollably. He wanted to speak, but no words would come. The injustice of it all, his own actions, hung in the air like a suffocating fog. The officers gave Greg a stern but calm warning before leaving the scene. Marcus, however, stayed behind. He walked over to Greg, who now stood at the foot of his porch, head hung low. "Look, I don't know what's in your heart," Marcus said softly, his voice full of a wisdom born from experience. "But I do know one thing. You didn't call the police out of malice. You were scared. We live in a world where fear often gets mistaken for truth." Greg looked up, guilt weighing him down. I didn't mean to. I just saw someone who didn't look like they belonged and reacted. I'm sorry." Marcus gave a small smile, not one of mockery, but one of understanding. "I get it. I really do. But this town is going to need you to be better. We all need to be better." Greg nodded, the words sinking deep into his soul. He had learned a painful lesson that morning, not just about fear, but about the need to question his assumptions and challenge his own biases. As Marcus turned to walk away, Greg watched him with a sense of admiration. He had just met the mayor of his city, but he had also met the man who would, perhaps, change him forever. The injustice he had witnessed today was only the beginning of a much larger journey, one that he hoped would make Oakwood a place where everyone truly belonged.